Wait, let me start again. Welcome to Ephesians chapter 5. How many people read it ahead of time before coming here? How many people were scandalized by what they read? Oh, good. This will be an easy class. I prompted you last week not to be scandalized and to read it in the right frame of mind. We're gonna go over it even further tonight, but I'm glad to hear that nobody was scandalized by it. If you recall, we ended last week, chapter 4, 2 verses into chapter 5, right? So we don't have to actually start with verse 1 and 2. We start with, wait, hold on. Hey, good. See, I didn't turn it on, so I didn't move forward. The three main topics for tonight are light, morals, and marriage. And we start with chapter 5, verse 3. I'm going to get in sync here in a second, I'm sure. And here, Paul is continuing what he was saying during chapter 4. If you recall, chapters 1, 2, and 3 are on theology. We're done with that because that hurts our brain. And now we're on chapter 4, 5, and 6, which is living out that theology, living out how we understand the faith. So with that, chapter 4, Paul was going through some positively worded things and some strongly worded things about how to live out the faith. Here's a bit of strongly worded things that he's saying, okay? He says, immorality or any impurity or greed. Greed, by the way, the Greek word underneath greed can be translated as greed or covetousness, okay? And you can, if you think about it, you can see how that would be the same. Greed is an inordinate desire for something I don't have. Covetousness is an inordinate desire for something I don't have that belongs to somebody else. So they're very similar, and whichever way it's supposed to be translated, neither one is supposed to be something that we do. So whichever way you want to translate it is up to you, but we shouldn't do it. Anyway, back to this. Immorality or any impurity or greed must not even be mentioned among you, as is fitting among holy ones. No obscenity or silly or suggestive talk which is out of place, but instead, thanksgiving. Does anybody happen to remember the Greek word for thanksgiving? Eucharistia, yes. So that pops up again here. He says we should be focused on the good things, and not necessarily wear T-shirts with slanderous things or slimy things and all that kind of stuff. And that kind of makes sense. Okay, so immorality or impurity or greed. Now he repeats this in the second sentence. He repeats those three things. Be sure of this, that no immoral or impure or greedy, covetous person, that is, an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. So he's saying that somebody is practicing those three or bound by those three is an idolater. Now what's an idolater? Worships idols. What's an idol? Is it a little statue that's made of a false god? Anything that comes between you and what God is saying is an idol. That can be greed, that can be immorality, that can be impurity. It doesn't necessarily mean an idol to some false god. It's anything that, if God says, hey, do this, and you say, okay, this is the right way to do it, but this idol says, do this decision, and you follow that, that's an idol. Okay? So immorality, impurity, greed is something that can say, I'm going to move away from God. Therefore, you're an idolater. And now notice, he says that no immoral or impure or greedy person, that is, an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. Going back 2 sessions ago when we were talking about what is believing in the Son, right? And we are saved by grace through faith. There's nothing here about faith or grace. It's just saying you can block that grace and stop yourself from being able to get into the kingdom of Christ and of God by holding your hand up and saying, I don't want you, right? The idol has pulled me away, so I don't want you, and I'm heading in this direction. So he's warning against that here. Next, verses 6 and 7. Let no one deceive you with empty arguments, for because of these things the wrath of God is coming upon the disobedient. We got back to wrath of God and sons of disobedience, right? He likes these phrases. So disobey and wrath is back from, again, chapter 2. But he says, let no one deceive. This is a continuation of what he was talking about last week. His obsession with the idea that truth is incredibly important, that we believe in truth, that we speak truth, and that we do not be deceived. Obviously those two are related, but we have to be on guard so as not to be deceived. So let no one deceive you with empty arguments. What would the empty arguments be in this case? Thinking about what we just came off of, let no immoral or impure or greedy person. Well, these are the people that, well, they're not quite following a good life. They're going to rationalize it. They're going to come up with their own excuses as to why they can do it, right? And they are not going to follow the will of God, regardless of whether or not they're focused on it or not. They're going to come up with empty arguments, false arguments as to why they should be doing these things. And you know you should be doing this. So don't be deceived by their empty arguments. If they want to go do that, but do not be associated with them. The word that's translated as be associated means to participate, to be a part of what they are doing. So if you want to be a good friend, try and talk them out of that, try and explain to them what's going, what's good for them, which we're going to cover in a little bit here. But at the very least, don't be associated with them. Don't participate in it. Now, the fun part, we're going to split off into two directions here on this next slide. I love this. 8 through 10. For you were once darkness, but you are light in the Lord. But now you are light in the Lord. Now remember, he's speaking to Gentiles primarily, who were outside the faith and are now inside the faith. So you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Notice the wording there. He's not saying you were once in darkness and you are now in light. He's saying you were once darkness. You were, in other words, you weren't affected by the light or the darkness. You are the light or the darkness affecting the world. There's a big difference between that. We have a responsibility, okay, not to be darkness, but to be light. So you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light. Told you we were going to get to children of light and children of the darkness tonight. This is where we're going to get it. Live as children of light, for light produces every kind of goodness and righteousness and truth. And we're going to get that last sentence here in a bit. I'm going to save that last sentence for a bit. So, the children of light, just light and dark by itself is a theme that happens in the New Testament quite a bit, right? And I wonder, actually, if we weren't primed with knowing Scripture, if light and dark would instantly give us the same feeling, right? You think light, dark, good, and evil, right? You instantly think that, right? So it's a really, really good metaphor. It might actually sort of just be built into the fabric of the universe. I don't know, but it's a really, really good metaphor. So live as children of the light. The difference between children of the light and children of the darkness, one of the best places I've found for it is the very beginning of Gospel of John. So if you want, turn to that. We're going to just go the first five verses real quick. I'm going to read it out loud so you don't have to turn to it. But I would suggest to you, just as an aside, if you've never spent some time just reading over the first 18 verses of the Gospel of John, it's beautiful. Just spend some time with the first 18 verses of the Gospel of John. It's just fabulous. It's called the prologue. It's so foundational that at Latin Mass, they end every single Mass reading this. This is how they end it. This is what they say just before you walk out. They just soak your mind in this. It's beautiful. Now we're just going to cover the first five verses, and we're going to come back to children of light here for a second. Okay? So the first 5 verses. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And here's the important one. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now, at some point in your life, you've heard those words, right? You're familiar with them, okay? The light shines in the darkness. Light has energy. Light does something. Darkness just sits there. Darkness can't really radiate. Light can radiate. So the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. That word overcome, the Greek word for that is translated as overcome is katalambano. Now, when I say it, it sounds like I'm talking about a Latin dance. So I'm probably not pronouncing it properly in Greek, but it's katalambano. It's spelled exactly like I'm saying it. And it has a double meaning. John, as he writes the Gospel of John, is famous for imparting double meanings in all sorts of things. He loves wordplay. And it's not that he has something that means two different things and you got to figure out which one is right. He puts things in that has two different meanings and both of them are right. And both of them are profound. And both of them we can grab stuff out of. This is one of them. It starts right off at the beginning of the Gospel of John. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Does anybody happen to have a translation that has a word other than overcome? Just out of curiosity. Yes, what do you got?
Did not comprehend it.
Did not comprehend it. That was the other word I was looking for. Okay. Anybody else have anything else? Stop. That was the one I was looking for. Okay. So those are the two ways to translate. Let me explain how. Katalambano means to grasp aggressively. Okay. So if you're going to overcome something and wrestle it to the ground, you're going to grasp it aggressively and wrestle to the ground if you're thinking physically. But if you're thinking mentally, to grasp something is to comprehend it. The children of the dark simply can't comprehend truth. And John here is using that word very intentionally to give two very separate, very true meanings. The darkness cannot overcome and wrestle to the ground truth. More powerful. They also can't comprehend the truth. And remember I said last night, if you've got friends of yours who you speak truth to and it just goes right over their heads, you're going to find out why right here. Children of the dark simply can't comprehend truth. It goes right by them. The analogy that I go for, and there's a couple of young folks in the room that you may not quite grasp this, but those of us who are like my age or so, you remember transistor radios and tuning in a station? See, now everything's like internet and there's no, you've never heard static on a radio.
That's not true.
That's not true? Okay. Okay. So I'm glad you've heard static. Okay. So tuning in a radio is something that I know, right? Tuning in a radio, especially a weak signal, right? Right now, as we're standing here, there's all sorts of radio signals bombarding this room. There's every radio station that's in the area is bombarding this room. We're not hearing it because we don't have a radio tuned to that frequency. What happens inside a radio when you tune it to that frequency is there's a little resonating circuit inside that radio that starts to bounce along with that signal, and now that signal comes out and you can hear it. So when you tune a radio to the truth signal, you can pick it out of all of the jumble. Children of the light are tuned to truth. Children of the dark aren't on that station. It can bounce all around and they just don't hear it. It's just that simple. It goes right by them. It's not necessarily that they're being obstinate or difficult. They simply can't comprehend, grasp the truth as it goes by them. Simply can't get it. Okay? Now, sometimes they're just simply being obstinate. I get that. Okay? But for those folks that you say, they don't seem to be obstinate, but they just don't get it. They're not quite tuned in. Pray for them to tune their radio properly, and they'll start picking up on that. As long as we're in John for a second, we're going to turn to chapter 8 real quick. I'm just going to hit 3 verses here just to give you an example of Jesus talking about this. Okay? Let me set the stage. In chapter 8, I'm going to start on verse 37. Chapter 8, verse 37, and a little bit beyond. To set the stage, Jesus is talking to the religious leaders of the day. And you think, the religious leaders of the day are practicing Jews. They've been the people have been brought up over centuries to understand, to trust God, to be a moral people, and most of all, to be on the lookout for the Messiah. If there was one thing that was most important to them, it's that. And Jesus is now talking to the very people whose lives are dedicated to finding the Messiah. And Jesus is standing in front of them, and they don't get it. Verse 37, he says, I know that you are descendants of Abraham, yet you seek to kill me, because my words find no place in you. Whoosh, right by. They're not getting it. Truth himself is speaking to them, and they don't see it. The Messiah is standing in front of them, and this is what they have dedicated their life to finding, and he's trying to talk, and they don't get it. Verse 43, why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot bear to hear my word. Now that's a little bit of a push, but it comes from that not being able to see it. And the last one is verse 47, where he says, he who is of God hears the word of God. The reason why you do not hear them is that you are not of God. Now he's not doing the radio tuning analogy, but do you see how the radio tuning analogy fits into that? You just don't get it. You're not of God. You can't hear you're hearing the words, right? My disciples heard the same words you heard. Why is it that they recognize that they're walking with the Son of God, and you are trying to kill me? Why is that? Children of light, children of the dark. So, and people can choose, people can pick sides, and people can wake up, which is why I say pray for those that aren't tuned in, because just this past weekend at Mass, we read from the Acts of the Apostles, and it talks about how people were coming into the faith, and at the very end of the reading, it talks about the priests who were now coming into the faith. They were starting to choose by their own free will to wake up and tune their radio. So in today's world, it's important to understand that there's some people that simply can't grasp truth, no matter whether they're staring in front of them or not. And typically, those people, they do grasp fear-based messages. Is mostly what attracts them. Anyway, yes.
Would you say then maybe a reason for them being in the dark or being the dark is because they have immoral, impure, or greedy, and allow those sinful things to control them, and so they're not walking the faith of God, and so by doing that, they just simply cannot see the truth?
Yes. If I answered you fully, I'd be getting ahead of myself, but you've nailed something that I'm about to say in a few minutes. So if I remember, I'll give you credit for saying it before I did when I get there. If I don't, just feel good about it. Okay, so that's children of light, children of the dark. Okay, that was the quickest topic of the night. Now, let's look at that last sentence. Try to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. Who has a word other than learn there? Grasp. Understand. There's find out. I'm trying to think of the different translations I've heard. Huh? Accept could be, yeah. Okay, so try it, and all of those have different shades of meaning. The Greek word underneath sort of says to test it out and find out what's true. That's sort of what it is, okay? But some of those translated words are sort of active words, and then some of them are sort of passive. Just try and figure it out, or as opposed to just go and aggressively try and figure it out. But we're just going to go with learn right now, because I've decided to, if you notice, I've got NAB up there. Normally I'm in the RSV translation, but chapter 5 is really good in the NAB, so I've switched over to the NAB for tonight. If you're wondering, hey, I'm not following along. Okay, so try to learn what is pleasing the Lord. Let's take that line, put it up top, and let's talk about that for a second. Okay, we're going to talk about try to learn in a sec. Let's just talk about for the first part, what is pleasing to the Lord. So, what is pleasing to the Lord? Don't give me a bullet list. Okay, don't say, well, this is pleasing, but conceptually, what is it that we do that is pleasing to the Lord?
Love.
Love.
Do His will.
Do His will.
Following the commandment.
Following the command. Oh, these are so good.
Be obedient.
Be obedient.
Serve.
Serve. Oh gosh, these are so good. All you're just sort of like saying everything I'm about. Well, actually, you're saying it better. Huh?
You're tuned in.
You're tuned in. This is great. Okay, so if we go back two lessons ago, chapter 2, when we were talking about what does it mean to believe in the Son? It means to be persuaded by His message, to entrust ourselves to His message, to adopt the worldview of the Father, right? Be obedient, do his will, love, serve, all of those things fit into that, because all of that is the worldview of the Father, right? So that's what God wants us to do. So there's another way to say that, which is to say to follow his moral code, okay? He wants us to be a moral people. And to be more precise, rather than to say his moral code, I should say the only moral code that exists. There aren't multiple moral codes. The reason for that is only God can create a moral code, and there's only one God. Therefore, there is only one moral code. Our current culture would like to think that there's all sorts of moral codes, and you get to just choose. That's not true. There's different political ideologies, but politics and morals are two very separate things. Morals come from God. Politics comes from people. And they like to blur that distinction so that if you run a Twitter poll and 800 of the 1,000 people say it's okay to take that apple from the tree, then Eve was justified in doing that she was doing a moral act. That's not true. She was doing a politically correct act. Politics says, okay, go ahead and do that. But morally, she doesn't have the power to say that this bad act is a good act. Only God is able to label something good or bad because he created everything. We don't have that capability. So we can't relabel something that is bad as good or relabel something that is good as bad. We don't have that capability. But modern culture would like to say, well, if you got a whole bunch of people on your side, then it's morally okay. No, it's not. It's politically okay. It's not morally okay. Okay? Off my soapbox. Okay. So, C.S. Lewis, oh wait, hold on. Yes. Morals come from God, politics come from man. I knew I was going to put that up there at some point. Now, C.S. Lewis says a fun little thing about, or I shouldn't say fun, it's a compact description of the three aspects of morality. He says that there's a social dimension, there's a personal dimension, and there's a direction dimension to morality. And the analogy he uses is pretty simple to follow. He says, imagine you are in a fleet of ships, and the goal is to go from here to that port over there. Well, there's a social, a personal, and a direction dimension of that. The social dimension would be that you don't swerve and bang into everybody's boat because eventually you're going to, have somebody sink or yourself sink. So socially, you don't bounce into people and hurt people. The personal dimension is that your boat itself should be outfitted correctly. Your engine should work right. You should have enough fuel. You should be able to steer the thing. Everything works on the boat. Otherwise, you're not going to make it. Okay? And you might not be able to steer. Therefore, your social thing gets out of whack. And then there's a direction dimension. What happens if socially and personally everything's fine? Nobody's bouncing into each other and everybody's got enough fuel to make it to the other side, but you make it to the wrong port. Where are we aimed? Heaven. We're aimed for heaven. We're aimed for God. What happens if we miss and we get over there? That's not where we want to be. Okay? So you have to not bounce into people. Make sure you are strong enough to make the journey with the Holy Spirit's help, and make sure you're aimed in the right direction. Those three aspects of morality all need to come in play. A lot of people think that morality is only that first part. As long as you don't bump into people, as long as you don't offend somebody, you're morally okay. And that's not true. If you're not okay, you're not morally okay. And if you're headed in the wrong direction, you're not morally okay. So all three have to be there. So what does it mean to exercise good morals? I like this next line because for two reasons. Quick description of it is doing what we ought to do, even when it's not what we want to do. Okay? Really simple description of exercising good morals. Now, some of you in the room have been blessed with the right temperament and the right personality that what you want to do is what you ought to do. Your wills are aligned with God for the most part. Therefore, on a daily basis, you don't have that many problems. You like doing what it is that God wants you to do. Then there are some of us who have a challenge in various areas where what we want to do is not necessarily what we ought to do. Anybody in my camp? Okay? Anybody in that first camp that you just every decision you make, it's like, that's exactly what I'd want to do. Okay? You're lucky. Okay? The rest of us, we have this problem. Okay? Now, the second reason I like this line is that word ought. Can anybody think of a synonym for that word ought? Should. Absolutely. That is the best synonym for the word ought. But it's deficient. But it is the best synonym. Okay? Should is what you should do. But it's more as a matter of propriety or expedience. You should have your salad fork on, I don't know what side it's supposed to be. You should do that. You should do this, but it's not going to kill you if you don't. You should. But when you ought to do something, that's stronger. That comes out of a sense of duty. Should doesn't come out of a sense of duty. Well, you could come up with sentences that does, but the should in general doesn't. What you ought to do comes from the word ought comes from the word owed. O-W-E-D. When you owe somebody money, okay? Back in the 17th century, or however long ago this word was coined, probably even further back, and it probably came from England. So, I ought that guy 5 shillings. I owe that guy 5 shillings. That's where the word ought comes from. It comes from a sense of debt. It comes from owing something to somebody. So, when we exercise good morals, we are doing it because we owe someone something. Who is it that we owe? Thanks. I knew that was going to be an easy answer. Every once in a while I ask a really easy one and everybody's like quiet. It's like, I didn't mean it as a trick question. It was real simple. Okay? So yes, we owe God. Okay? For all that he's done for us, that's why we ought to do that. Okay? So, now what motivates us to exercise good morals? I'm about to click something and it's going to have 4 items on there. They're really short because they fit in one line. 4 different reasons that I can come up with. Theologians can probably come up with dozens. But 4 different reasons that motivate us to exercise good morals. Can anybody come up with one? Conscience?
Guilt.
What? Guilt? Anything else? Love of? God, yes.
Desire to go to heaven.
Desire to go to heaven? What's the opposite of that? Okay. And there's one more that you may not remember. They came to me based upon what we talked about 2 weeks ago. What I've got up here, and there's more than that, okay? Love of God, desire for heaven, fear of hell, and our own good. And again, there might be more than that, okay? Some of these are more noble reasons than others. Just like when we go to confessions, sometimes there are more noble reasons to go. If we're going there simply for the fear of hell, that's an acceptable reason to go to confession. But the better one is love of God. But both are acceptable, okay? One is contrition, one is attrition, and I'm not going to go into that right now. But all of those are acceptable reasons to exercise good morals, okay? Hopefully, at some point, we move over to the love of God side, okay? But if all we're doing it is out of fear of whatever, that's okay. That last one, our own good, that goes back to what we talked about 2 weeks ago. If you have been persuaded by the Son that the Father's worldview is the best possible way to live, then out of a sense of self-interest, that's how you would live, right? For your own good. It's self-interest. Forget the supernatural portion of it. If you've been convinced this is the most successful, most happy, most joyous possible way to live, I would want to live that way. If there's these other things, that's great, but it's just out of a sense of self-interest. So there's all those ways, and there are more as well. Okay, but I like those, so I throw them up there. God wants us to exercise good morals for the same reason. Okay, because He loves us, and because He loves us the right way and wants our best. Then if that's best for us, He wants it for the same reason. So God wants us to exercise good morals for the same reason. Now, I've used a couple of analogies of a human father and a son. Human father and an older son and a younger son. A human father and a bunch of kids at a table. I've used I've used variations on that analogy a couple of times. Let me now just talk about God the Father, perfect, and us. God is perfectly loving, infinitely intelligent, can't be wrong, can't lie, and knows everything. He created us. He knows exactly how we operate. He knows what is the best thing for us. He knows that, which is why he put the Bible together, why he revealed these things to us. And so he knows the perfect, God who created us gives us the perfect life manual. That's what he's doing in Ephesians and elsewhere in the Bible. He's giving us the perfect life manual. If we can just extract everything from it and live that way, that is the best possible way to live. And he does that out of love. Okay? A more down to earth, if you want to call it, non-spiritual, just earthly example is, let's say you bought a Ferrari. Wouldn't that be fun? Anybody own a, forget it. Let's say you bought a Ferrari. Well, Ferrari's not only going to give you the car, they're going to give you a user's manual. Because they built the car. They know what's good for the car. They know what's bad for the car. They know how you can hurt yourself in the car. So they're going to give you this manual to know that if you go past this RPM, you might not damage the engine the first time, but you're eventually going to damage the engine, so don't do that. It's not good for the engine. They're going to know exactly how fast you can go around a turn before you hurt the car and yourself. They're going to give you all these things. What kind of oil to put in it. Because they built the car. They know it. We are infinitely more valuable and infinitely more complex than a Ferrari. So luckily, we've got an infinitely smarter guy giving us the life manual, okay? That's why Jesus came, to reveal the heart of the Father and to reveal the good plan for our life. That was the whole purpose. Now, this, I love explaining this because this next part, because when I first heard this from somebody, or heard part of this from somebody, it was like, wow, that's pretty cool. You've all heard of the Ten Commandments, right? If not, we can sort of step back and walk through them. This was like the start of God teaching a people how to be moral. And there was more past that, but that was the beginning, right? The Ten Commandments came down. And one of those 10 commandments was, thou shalt not murder. A lot of people think that it's thou shalt not kill, but it's not true. There are appropriate times to kill, a just war, etc. But it's thou shalt not murder is in the 10 Commandments. Now think about this. The day before the 10 Commandments came down, nobody knew that murder was wrong. There was a time in human history where people didn't realize that that was a bad moral thing. It's amazing, okay? So now God says, we'll just pick on this one. Thou shalt not murder. And you got all of them, and we could probably get all 10 if I asked, but you sort of know. Everybody can spout about 4 or 5, and then they sort of stop. But you know what they are. But let's just focus on the thou shalt not murder for a second. There's these 10 pylons out there that represent the 10 Commandments, and they're sort of blocking us from what we, in our bad selves, want to do. So there's this pylon here that says, thou shalt not murder, which keeps all those people over there safe because I want to murder them, right? But it's an external pylon. And if I'm clever and devious, I can step to the side, walk past the pylon, and get to, right? Well, you said, thou shalt not murder. You didn't tell me I can't hire somebody to murder the guy. It's a workaround because it's an external law, right? Right? Would you be convicted in court? Thou shalt not murder. I didn't murder. I hired somebody to murder. You didn't say, okay, number 11 is thou shalt not hire somebody to murder. And now there's a new pylon that sticks over there. But then I figure out that this is where the book of Leviticus comes from. If you've ever read the book of Leviticus, which I don't recommend, it's very boring, it's just 500, 600 different laws of all of these little stopgap measures to stop people from doing bad things because they're walking around the pylons, because they're external laws. And then Jesus comes. And what does he do? He says, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Don't need any of the pylons. It's all gone. It's brilliant. I mean, I was like flabbergasted when I first, here I am being flabbergasted that God is smart. It's just, it's something rings uncorrect in my brain about that. But Jesus comes and condenses all of the Ten Commandments, all of the book of Leviticus down to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And because you wouldn't want to do that to yourself, you just don't do it. And because it's not an external law, it's an internal law, I'm stopped before I even get out of myself. I can't sidestep anything. I'm stuck right here. It's beautiful. It's short, it's sweet, we can remember it, and it's more powerful than all of those laws and 1,000 more of them. It's just fantastic. So it's an amazing contraction of everything, but yet it's fuller. So does morality mean that we have a restriction on us? Do we live a lesser life? C.S. Lewis comes to the rescue with a cute little statement here. I can't remember which book it's in, but it's right at the beginning of the book. It's right at the beginning of a chapter. I remember this. And C.S. Lewis says, quote, "There's a story about a schoolboy who was asked what he thought God was like. He, schoolboy, replied that as far as he could make out, God was, quote, the sort of person who's always snooping around to see if anyone's enjoying themselves and then trying to stop it." And a lot of people think that, okay? A lot of people think that. You say, oh, live a moral life. Well, somehow that's smaller, right? That's what we're taught by the world out there. That if you live a good life, you're somehow living smaller. So don't live bigger, meaning live an immoral life. They want to say that sin is more and virtue is somehow less. But does morality actually limit our freedom? Well, no. True freedom is the result of doing the right thing. It comes from that. Okay? Now, we can see what is bad physically, but spiritually, things are harder to see. So that's why we need God to reveal to us what is bad spiritually, because we don't have as firm a grasp. If you recall from, I think it was last week, I used the gas tank analogy, right? I said, okay, pouring sugar in a gas tank, really bad, okay? Really, really bad. But we have the free will to do so. But we don't, okay? Because we know it's bad. On the spiritual side, it's harder to grasp things. So we need the revelation of God to know what is bad and to trust Him so that we don't do those things, okay? I'll give you another example. We are both body and soul, but the body's easier to understand, right? The spiritual side's harder to understand, so I'll use an example from the body. I spent about 15 or so years in the orthotics and prosthetics industry, designing CAD systems to help fit artificial limbs and braces. And while I was in that industry, I learned a lot of interesting things. One is that eating sweets can lead to having your foot amputated. And some of you instantly went, I know, because you know the steps that it takes to get there. Some of you don't, right? So those of you who don't, it would be sort of like the spiritual side. How do you get from here to here? I don't get it. Reveal that to me, right? So eating sweets can lead to your foot being amputated. Now, I want to say at the outset, there are other reasons why your foot gets amputated. It's not just eating sweets. Okay, if you ever get your foot amputated, I'm not blaming you by eating too many sweets. That's not what I'm saying. Okay? But there is a causal link that goes on here. What happens when you eat too many sweets? Diabetes. Okay? What happens when you have diabetes? Poor circulation. I'm looking for peripheral neuropathy. Anybody want to say peripheral neuropathy? Peripheral neuropathy. Okay? And that means peripheral, hands and feet, neuropathy, the nerves break down. Okay? Now that can result in a couple of different ways. That can manifest itself in a couple of different ways. You can end up getting pain or itching, tingling, stabbing, or numbness. Now, if you think, okay, you got those options, which one do you want? I want to be numb. No, you don't. Because when you're numb, you don't know when things are going wrong. If you have peripheral neuropathy and you can't feel your feet, you can walk into something, break your toe, you have no idea. Absolutely no idea. You can be rubbing inside your shoe, you don't realize you're rubbing it wrong. And you have an ulcer on the foot and you simply don't know. If you're not actively checking the bottom of your feet, you end up with ulcers who, because of the poor circulation, somebody said that, they don't heal very well. even with intervention. So you got sweets going to diabetes, going to poor circulation and peripheral neuropathy, going to perhaps ulcers, going to eventually gangrene and amputation, Charcot foot or full amputation. And again, that's not the only reason for amputations. I'm just saying that sometimes there's these things, and in the spiritual world, it's the same thing. We do something, we don't realize it's going to end up there. God does. So he says, don't do that, so you don't lead to there. There might be other things that get you there, just like the amputation, but at least don't do this one to get you there. You follow? So, going back to what I have up here, true freedom is the result of doing the right thing. True freedom is being able to walk on both feet. True freedom is not having that problem. So true freedom comes from doing the right thing. In this case, not eating, sweets in excess, which then right? Again, you might have other things that end up having problems with your feet, but at least that one didn't have it. So true freedom, the freedom of being able to walk, the freedom of not being in pain, the freedom of not all that kind of stuff, comes from doing the right thing. So freedom comes from doing the right thing. Another very quick example is, and I don't think anybody in this room, suffers from this desire, going to a headbanger concert with this really, really loud music, okay? You do that and you end up with no hearing, okay? So the freedom of being able to hear means that we restrain ourselves from going to, massively loud concerts, at least not with huge bubble wrap around our heads. Although I don't have any desire to go there anyway. So that's what is pleasing to the Lord. Now, how do we learn? How do we figure out what is pleasing to the Lord? And somebody said it at the beginning. I think it was Deacon Randy. Conscience. Okay. So we discern right from wrong using our conscience. Conscience. I love this word. I love words that break apart really easy and they show you what it means. Conscience is con, science. Con, with, right? Arroz con pollo, con, with, right? Con is with, science is knowledge. So conscience is with knowledge. You make decisions on right and wrong with the knowledge that God has built into you. And the formation that you constantly do to your conscience because we want to follow the will of God. So he gives us a starter pack when we're born, and then it's our duty to constantly inform that and build that and make it stronger so that we get better at determining right from wrong using our with knowledge, using our conscience. Interesting, yes?
Because the only thing I want to say in there, because I remember people say, oh, my conscience told me to do this or that, but it has to be a well-formed conscience.
Correct.
And I think that's, I didn't get that for a long while.
Yeah.
That distinction, I think it's really important.
Yeah, there's that computer term, garbage in, garbage out. If you're feeding yourself with those empty arguments, do not be deceived by empty arguments that Paul warns against. If you're feeding yourself with that, then what are you doing? You're forming your with knowledge with garbage. So you've got all the rationalizations to do all the wrong things. So your conscience is actually working against you. Okay?
And now you're blind.
And and then you've lost your foot. So you're back to that. So the idea is to I'm glad you brought that up, is to form your conscience well, so you have your well-formed conscience. So have you ever been in a situation where you've got some temptation that's bothering you, or something that is tempting you, and you're sort of you're going back and forth. It's one of those things, and you know it's not the right thing, but there's part of you that's rationalizing. You're going back and forth, and there's this little internal dialogue in your head. It's always like two people going back and forth in your head. Has anybody ever experienced that? That's you having a conversation with your conscience. That's literally you having a conversation with the Holy Spirit. It's literally what it is. Have you ever wondered if you've ever talked to God? In those moments, you're talking to God. Okay? Listen. He knows more than you. Okay? But I've had those conversations, and I didn't realize I'm actually talking to God. Okay? That's sort of what takes place. It's an internal dialogue that takes place. So God created us and sort of embedded a starter kit of that user's manual, that moral code inside us. Now here's the thing. That moral code, that worldview of God is the best possible way to live. Right? It is the way we will be most happy. It's the way we'll get to heaven. It's the way we will live the most exciting, joyous life where we can sleep well at night, and we're not looking over our shoulder. It's the best possible way to live. Any action against the moral code is an action against our very nature. It works against us. Therefore, any action against the moral code is by definition destructive. Children of the darkness work that way. They're just constantly making destructive decisions. Those who are darkened are constantly acting against themselves. It's important not to fight or ignore the moral code. Now, when I taught RCIA, I got to this stage and I said something that probably doesn't need to be said to this room, but I'm going to say it anyway because it was well received then, and I'll say it now. If you're ever in a situation where you've got some temptation that you're struggling with, and your side is winning, and you're going to go. If you find yourself in that situation, accept the fact that you're going to sin, and then go to confession, make yourself right with God, and get back on the right track and follow the ideal. What you don't want to do is what the children of the dark do, and rip that page out of the user's manual. Right? I want to do that. This says I can't, I rip that out. I've uninformed my conscience. And now I have no stress because there's nothing in my conscience that's telling me what I've done is wrong. You follow what I'm saying? Don't rip that page out of the user's manual, because that is the only thing that directs you back to God. Don't rip the page out. Accept the fact. I'm not giving you license to sin. First of all, I don't have that authority, okay? Okay? But if you are going to, leave the page in the user's manual. And then make it right with God. Okay? There's no way back to God if you don't have the clue on how to make it back. So, from there, Paul continues on until we get to Ephesians 5, verses 21 through 33, the marriage section. Now, I'm going to say a couple of things before we get there, just to set the stage so that we're all on the same page, or at least you know, or I should say, at least you know what page I'm on as we speak. I respect the fact if some of you are on a different page, okay? But I will tell you what I'm saying, and challenge me if you need to, if I don't say something right, okay? First of all, these are instructions to Christian husbands and wives. These instructions don't help pagans, Gentiles, anybody who's not following God, anybody who doesn't know Christ, because they won't understand it. And you'll understand why as we go through this. To understand true marriage, you must understand Christ. Because of that relationship, because of that analogy between Christ and the church to marriage, you have to understand how that works. You have to have gone through RCIA. You have to have been catechized well. You have to understand the relationship between God and His church to understand marriage properly. So it's not, if you say, well, Gentiles wouldn't, not that you're thinking this, but Gentiles wouldn't agree with this. You're right. They wouldn't. This is only instructions to Christian husbands and wives. The listeners have to know what the Lord has done for us to make sense of this. And these instructions work as long as both halves are making a good faith effort, maybe not perfect, but a good faith effort to move forward with Paul's admonitions here. You'll notice as we go through it, there's no practical advice anywhere. There's no do this when this happens, do this when this happens. It's all about the attitude of marriage. It's all about the attitude, because if you got the right attitude, you know how to act in different situations. Okay? We already talked about consider, the love your neighbor, right? Jesus took all of that stuff and took it down to love your neighbor. In other words, have the right attitude. And when you love your neighbor, there's no rules, there's just attitude. If you know how to think, you'll know how to act in every situation. You don't need 600 rules if you know love your neighbor. You don't need a marriage manual that covers every last little situation you might have in your marriage. If you have the right attitude, you know what to do in all those things. You may not do it properly, but you'll at least, upon reflection later on at night, when you've resolved it, you'll know what you should have done. Okay? So your attitude will inform you. Okay? If you know how to think, you'll know how to act. And that's what Paul is going through. Now, the other thing is If you've noticed, as Paul goes through it, he's making an analogy, as I've already alluded to, that the relationship between Christ and his church is similar to or analogous to the relationship between husband and wife. That analogy will break down at some point. Human husbands are not divine like Christ is, okay? So the analogy breaks down. But what he's doing is saying that we are an echo of that love, of that relationship. And if we look at it as a model, we will know how to act, okay? The analogies will give an insight on one or two elements, and then they break down, okay? Or at least this one does, for sure. In the Greek, in the original Greek, on verse 24, it's not important, but in verse 24 happens to be where it is, Paul actually even alludes to the fact that he knows that the analogy is breaking down by putting in a but or a yet. I can't remember exactly what the wording is. If I remember when we get there, I'll say it. And now I'm trying to remember what it was that you said that I said when we get there I was going to give you credit. We've already gone past it. But what you said, I just covered. Okay, so in verse 24, Paul puts in a but or a yet, knowing that the analogy is breaking down. And if I remember, I'll mention it when we get there. Note that Paul addresses wives as free persons who can choose for themselves. In the world that this letter went into, that is unheard of. Wives were property. Men simply ruled. So for Paul to address wives and to even imply, much less flat out state, that they have the dignity to choose for themselves what they are going to do is amazing. We don't give them credit for that. But it's absolutely amazing. What?
In their time it was considered progressive then.
Yes. Well,
or kind of like, yeah.
well, for progressive has the connotation today of moving forward in the direction we want to go.
Right.
This would not be
No.
moving forward in the direction we want to go for that world. The men loved it. They just simply ruled, right? Paul's saying, no, equal in dignity, and women, you have a choice to make. Men, you have a choice to make. I'm going to exhort you to do something that is going to make things better, but it's your choice. So, some insights from Pope St. John Paul II. He says, and I quote, "The essence of the love of a husband is to lay down his life for his bride." That's the essence of what it means to be a husband, to lay down your life for your bride. Guys, we're going to get beat up in the next couple of minutes. We just are, okay? There's one verse here that's going to make all the women bristle, and then us guys are just going to shrivel up for the rest of the time, because we are really get hammered as we go through this. So John Paul, the essence of the love of a husband is to lay down his life for his bride. And he goes on to say, although husbands and wives are equal in dignity, their roles in the family are not identical. We are not interchangeable. Now that doesn't mean that in certain family situations, with certain work situations, with certain personalities, that you might flip this and that. That's not what's being said here. Okay? But in general, there are roles. We know what they are. We know what they are. The very fact that people want to switch from one to the other means that they know what the other side is. There are traditional roles. Okay? And God created this order. Go back to Genesis. He created this order. And it works together so that we're, as John Paul II says, there are irreducible differences between men and women. They are created by God as complementary. We come together to create a whole, to create a nuclear family, to move forward. With all of that said, let's move into the text. Start off with the bomb right here at the beginning. Okay? But before we get to the bomb, which is the second sentence on the screen, look at the first sentence.
Right, I love it.
Be subordinate to one another out of reverence for Christ. Who wins? Who's above the other in that sentence?
Everyone.
And this is said to everyone. And then, second comes wives should be subordinate to their husbands as to the Lord, which is a subset of the first sentence. Right? Because the first sentence is everyone be subordinate to everyone. A subset of everyone is wives, a subset of everyone is husbands. So that second sentence is actually said within the first sentence. But somehow when it gets to be the second sentence, everybody goes, oh my gosh, it's terrible. I understand why. Okay, I do. I understand why. But let's break this down. Okay? First of all, that word subordinate. Subordinate, if you look at math, how are we going to get to math? Ordinal numbers. Anybody know what the ordinal numbers are? They're first, second, third, fourth, right? Not 1, 2, 3, 4, but first, second, third, fourth. To be subordinate says don't put yourself first. Always, in every interaction with anyone else, try to serve. Try to serve. And so that's where we go. There's no direct, perfect translation of the Greek word. Subordinate is kind of close. But there's no direct translation because it uses a verb tense that we don't have in English. I think it's Greek aorist or something like that. I don't know. I'm not a Greek scholar by any stretch of the imagination. But it's the verb tense where you do something to yourself. And we don't really have that in English. So be subordinate is the closest. I can explain it in a couple of sentences and you'll understand what's meant there. But when you're just translating a Bible, you're going to put a word or two in and move on. Okay, you might have it in the footnotes or something, or here. But as you're going through, be subordinate closest and move on. But it's not something that is imposed on someone. It's something that someone chooses to do to themselves, to surrender or submit to another person. And using that analogy of husband, wife, Christ, church, subordinate, or to be subordinate, to surrender or submit to someone else, it's the church's response to Jesus. We surrender or submit, right? We've used that word before. Now, I told you I like another word, and we're going to get to that in a second. But surrender or submit is an appropriate word when you're talking about Jesus, okay? It should be an appropriate word within a family unit as well, but sometimes that comes up, that bristles, okay? Subordination is something that's done in response to love. So it's not, be subordinate to one another out of reverence for Christ. We're all Christians, we love one another, right? And therefore we want to not put ourselves first, but to serve whenever possible. But then when he repeats it and singles out the wife, it gets a little difficult. Okay? Father John Ricardo. Does anybody know him? Okay. Father John Ricardo, brilliant guy. Explains things wonderfully. He did his master's thesis, doctoral thesis. He did a thesis on this section. It's like 100 and some odd pages long on just these couple of verses. It's brilliant. I haven't read the whole thing, but I have heard him talk on this. And he mentions during one of his talks that a friend of his, when they were talking about this, they came up with an alternate, not really a translation, but an alternate statement, a paraphrase of that second sentence. The paraphrase, not a translation, but a paraphrase of it, if you understand the context of everything that's going on, you understand the words, you understand what's meant by it, and you understand what Paul is saying, the paraphrase goes like this. Here it is. Wives, as persons who are absolutely equal in dignity to your husbands, choose to entrust yourselves to their loving care. As Christ does, as the body of Christ does to the church, we entrust ourselves to Christ's loving care. Okay? Now, that, of course, presumes that loving care is there. Guys, get ready to get beat up. Okay? That implies that loving care is there, but that's what the goal is here. Absolutely equal in dignity, but entrust yourselves, right? That idea of surrendering or submitting, I mentioned a couple of classes ago. I don't like those words because you can surrender or submit to a tyrant, but you can only entrust yourselves to somebody that you trust, that you know is on your side. So I like that word better. So I'm glad that Father John used that. Where am I? Wait, I've lost my place. I don't do that very often. Okay, so subordination is sort of like believing by entrusting yourself. Going back a couple of sessions here. Now, Paul here, when he says, as to the Lord, he's building an analogy. As we go through these next few verses, he's building an analogy. That analogy that a marriage is in some levels analogous to the relationship between Christ and his church, his husband to wife. It breaks down, like I said, but this as to the Lord is wives should be subordinate to their husbands as they would be to the Lord. Okay? Entrusting yourself to his loving care. So notice as we build this analogy. And also remember, she gets to choose. The wife gets to choose. Again, when this was written, absolutely unheard of. I understand on one more level why Paul was persecuted, thrown in prison and beaten and all the rest of the stuff. I understand on one more level. All these guys, maybe they got a wind of this, you know. Meanwhile, today, wives are upset by it. But back then, I'll go off on that. I won't be back. Okay, next, verses 23 and 24. For the husband is head of his wife, just as Christ is head of the church. Let's stop there for a second. What does head mean? This is another bristle moment, right? Christ is head of his wife, just as Christ is head of the church. I'm sorry, for the husband is head of his wife, just as Christ is head of the church. This isn't like head boss. This is more like head servant. At the Last Supper, who washed the feet?
Christ.
Head servant. As Christ is to the church, as the husband is to the wife. Head servant. Guys, we're supposed to be washing feet. Not supposed to be lording over. That's not how we interpret this. We interpret this as a sacrificial admonition, sacrificial exhortation. Okay, we haven't even gotten to it in depth yet. Husband is head of the wife, just as Christ is head of the church. And this, by the way, is where Paul, in the original Greek, puts in, but Christ is himself the Savior of the body. Meaning, the husband isn't. Okay, this is where the analogy breaks down. But these other parts, to the extent that we mortals can echo the love of God in that relationship between Christ and the church, we go as far as we can. But we are not saviors. Okay? So as the church is subordinate to Christ, so wives should be subordinate to their husbands and everything, which is just an echo of what was just said. Now, interestingly, we're talking about head and body, which are interdependent. They depend on one another. Okay? Can the head live without the body? Can the body live without the head? If the body is sick, is the head sick? The head's sick. Sometimes married couples don't realize this. It's like, I want to one up. No, if you make the other one less, you get less. It's build up, and you come together. Next. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church. How did Christ love the church? You know, crucifix is all the way in the back of the room. I won't make you turn around. That's the ultimate display of love. And that's what we're called to. That's what Paul is calling us to. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and handed himself over for her to sanctify her. The Greek word that's translated as handed himself over in the New Testament, it always basically refers to the cross. It refers to handing yourself over to the cross. And, bless you. It's just a shorthand for the cross. Paul is telling husbands to sacrifice, even your whole life, for your wife. Some men feel that this verse 25, is one of the hardest verses in the entire Bible, especially one of the hardest ones to live up to. I know that on occasions, on pretty good days, I live up to that. And then on a whole lot of days, I don't live up to it. But I know what I'm supposed to be doing. Okay? There's something about a man. I'm ready to run into a burning building, but on a day-to-day basis, am I going to? It's harder for me. It's harder for me. You know? Would you run into a burning building for? Absolutely! Give me that chance. Oh, I've longed my whole life to run into a burning building.
What would be the last time?
Yeah, exactly. But put away the dishes? You know, that's a step beyond. And but we're called upon to do everything, even the little things. So it's the way it goes. Now, husbands, love your wives even as Christ loved the church. There's something interesting about this. There's 4 Greek words that get translated as the word love. Have I covered this yet in this course? It's 4 Greek words. I'll cover it anyway, just in case. Real quick. 4 Greek words that are translated as love in English. Storge, which means something that's cute. You know, this little puppy is really cute. Storge, oh, it's affectionate, and you sort of have this little affectionate love. Oh, this is so cute. Okay. There's philia, which is brotherly love, family love, or friendship love. Okay. That's a different kind of love than this cute little dog down here. Okay. Then there's eros, erotic love. That's a whole different love, hopefully, from the dog or the family. Okay. And then there's agape love, and that's what we're talking about. Agape, the best definition I've heard is willing the good of the other, wanting to do, wanting something good for the other, and then, if possible, doing something about it. We're not always in the position to do something about it, but at least willing the good of the other, the genuine good of the other. Going back to what Michelle said, we have to have a well-formed conscience to know what is actually good for them. Sometimes people think being kind and being nice and affirming is good. No, sometimes that's not the good. Willing the true good of the other is agape. And Paul is recognizing the fact, in my view, when I see this, Paul is recognizing the fact that sometimes, guys, we don't understand what love means. So he's saying, love your wives. Okay, I'll explain it to you. Even as Christ loved the church and handed himself over. This is what the love I'm talking, not, oh, she's so cute, or I like her as a friend, or erotic. No, it's more than that. It's agape. It's willing the good of the other and going to the extreme with sacrifice. Husbands, love your wives in this way, even as Christ loved the church and handed himself over for her to sanctify her, and for the rest. This exhortation, this suggestion by Paul to love your wives, to say to husbands, love your wives, is unique in the ancient world. You don't find this in Greco-Roman household codes, which is a sort of an echo of, or rabbinic literature in the Old Testament. You don't see it. You don't see it in the Gentile world. You don't see it in the pagan world. Okay, men just weren't told to do that. There were no self-help books. Oh, how to love your wife. There wasn't any of that kind of stuff. There wasn't mention of that. This is like the precursor to all of that. And another paraphrase of that is that comes from Father John is that first section there is, husbands, set your hearts on your wives, prize, cherish, and care for them. Be affectionate towards them and seek their good. That's what he's saying. And in the ancient world, in Greco-Roman household codes, nobody told the man what to do. The Greco-Roman household codes were written for everybody else in the household what they should be doing. The guy was never told what to do. And now here, Paul is taking the guys to task and saying, this is what you need to do. And which, again, is partially maybe why he was beaten and imprisoned so often, I don't know. But if husbands, oh wait, hold on, mention something else. And if you think about this as formal writing and the way things worked back then, the very fact that Paul is talking to husbands and wives but addresses the wife first, puts her in the place of honor by addressing her first before the husband, is amazing. Okay? It's just amazing. And we will continue this theme at the beginning of next week, because the beginning of chapter 6 continues the household code, not in marriage side, but in other parts. So, one last thing and we'll get off of this. Husbands, love your wives even as Christ loved the church and handed himself over to sanctify her. That's sacrificial love. When a husband loves that way, it's easy for the wife to entrust herself to your loving care, because it is loving care. It's very easy. And when a husband does not love that way, then there's really nothing that the wife can entrust herself to. And you end up with an empty connection because it's supposed to be built this way. That's true marriage. Everything else is a contract. Okay? Marriage is a sacrament, meaning an oath to God. Sacramentum in Latin. Okay? It's not a contract. It's a sacrament. So, next. We continue with guys. So also, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. Again, Paul's sort of telling us how to love. Love as if it's your own body, okay? He realizes we don't know this word. We don't get it, okay? And he echoes this over and over and over again in this little section, okay? He who loves his wife loves himself. I don't have an underline for that. For no one hates his own flesh, but rather nourishes and cherishes it, even as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body, okay? Again, just on a rational level, you don't harm yourself. You want the best for yourself. And Paul is saying, you want to love your wife the right way? Treat her as if you're treating yourself. You're going to do the best for yourself. It's an echo of love your neighbor as yourself, right? And then he quotes Genesis. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Again, she's your own flesh. Paul is teaching men how to internalize that word love properly. Not eros, not storge, oh, how cute. Not philia, I'm great friends with her, but agape. I'm going to sacrifice, and I'm going to do this every day. She's never going to worry about whether or not she can entrust herself to my care, because this is what I'm going to do. Last one. We're going to talk about this for a little while, so we're not done, but we're close. And look at this, I've actually got some time left. We'll see if we can squander this time if we go through. So let me just read it through, and then I'm going to say something that I'm going to tackle. Okay, this is a great mystery. Go back to that word mystery. But I speak in reference to Christ and the church. In any case, each one of you should love his wife as himself. There's that as himself again. And the wife should respect her husband. Does anybody in their Bible translation have a word other than respect on that last line? Larissa just walked out for some reason. She's got, I know the translation she's using, she's got a different word. But there's a different word for that. But before we get there, this is a great mystery. Remember, mysteries are not something that we can't understand, that we can't know, but it's only when God reveals it. So God has revealed this analogy of Christ to the church, Christ to the body of Christ, Christ to the body of Christ, right, the head to the body, to husbands and wives. So that part is the mystery. Larissa, I know you use you're using a different translation. Look up verse 33 and tell me what's in yours in place of the word respect. Because this goes to the Greek word that's underneath it. We're going to just handle this real quick.
Fear.
Fear. How do you like that one in your Bible? And the wife should fear her husband. I knew that was there. I was waiting for somebody to say, it says fear, it says obey, it says whatever. And the wife should fear her husband. That's actually almost perfect translation. Because the Greek word underneath respect is phobos, where we get phobia from, when you're afraid of something. Okay? So it's almost a direct translation. So why in the world do they put respect everywhere? Okay? That word phobos is in the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, but there's also a Greek translation of it, the Septuagint, if you didn't know. In Proverbs, chapter 9, verse 10, there's a verse that you've all heard before. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Phobos. Are we supposed to be afraid of God?
No.
So what does that mean? Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Respect. Awe. Admiration. Being able to trust what he says. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. You have to accept the fact that he created everything and he knows everything. That's the beginning of wisdom. Accepting that when something is said from the Lord, I can trust it. So fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That makes sense. But it's fear. It's phobos. And that's actually translated as fear. But we all know that that's not what it's meant to be. Going to the New Testament, if you go to Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, verse 32. This is a scene where Jesus is walking towards Jerusalem and his disciples are following along behind him, and that verse, Mark 10:32, talks about that the disciples were amazed and afraid. Are we supposed to be afraid of Jesus? It's the same word, phobos. We're in awe, right? It's the awe of the Lord. The word fear, I think, has gone through perhaps some change as we've gone through the centuries. And that word awe and respect and recognizing that there's something there, hopefully that is good, that I can entrust myself to, that's fear, that's awe, that's respect. That's the fear of God, okay? We're not supposed to be afraid of God or of Christ. We're not supposed to be afraid of our husbands. So respect is a proper translation of that. So mystery, it's a revealed secret. So now Paul knows what this revealed secret is, and he's passing it along to us. So he's saying that the mystery is in reference to Christ and the church. That analogy that I've mentioned several times, that Christ to the body of Christ is similar to the husband to the wife. So what are the main aspects of the relationship between Christ and the church? What are the main relationship? Because we're looking at relationship advice here from Paul, okay? And I would argue that Christ cares for and loves the church, and through sacrifice protects and provides for her. And you can swap in husband there. Although the husband's going to do it imperfectly because the husband has a fallen human nature. The church, on the other hand, the flip side of that relationship, the church sees that love and care and sacrifice, and in response respects and entrusts herself to Christ. And you can see how that analogy works. So if you swap in husband and wife there, in the best setting, that's how that's supposed to work. Does it always work that way? No, not always. But even when it doesn't work, I'm going to go through this. Even when it's imperfect, there is a way that this still works. Okay, first of all, where is the analogy imperfect? Okay, the analogy is imperfect. First of all, as we already mentioned, the husband's not divine. He's not all-knowing. He's not the wife's savior or anything else like that. We can put that one aside. Okay, Paul's not going there, and he even mentions that. Right when he says Christ is the Savior, God, but the guy is not. Okay. Here's where the analogy is imperfect. Christ will always love and sacrifice perfectly, but the husband may falter. We've got a fallen human nature. Okay. I've already said, putting the dishes away, difficult for me. Running into the burning building, ready to do that. It's crazy. It's just the way men's brains work. It's crazy. On the flip side, on the church, where the analogy is imperfect there, is the church may not respect and entrust themselves perfectly to Christ. Again, because of that fallen human nature. But because Christ will always love perfectly, our failure, and he does that because our failures don't affect him. He doesn't have a man's ego. When he's not treated well, he still loves perfectly. That's one place where the analogy breaks down. You never wonder whether or not Christ is going to show up and be on your side. Husbands, we can get our noses blunted and perhaps not love very well that day. That's where the analogy breaks down. The outward love of Christ is always perfect. Even if the inward, inbound respect fails, he remains perfect. But a husband or a wife, wives, you fall into this, a husband or a wife can see the failures of the other and have it affect their attitude towards the other. Right? So you're not doing your part, I'm not going to do my part. Okay? But we can learn a lot from where this analogy is imperfect. Seems like it's gotten tense in the room. Have I made it tense in the room? I'm sorry. Paul was real nice to you guys. I'm just laying it out. Okay. We can learn a lot. Because the analogy is imperfect, we can learn a lot. We should always strive to be perfect on our side and graciously absorb imperfections from the other side. Because look at how perfect the relationship is between Christ and the church. Because one side is perfect. the relationship is always perfect. So, you want a perfect relationship, all you need is one side to be perfect. I'm not suggesting to be a doormat. I'm not. Okay? But to the extent you can go to the extreme where Jesus just doesn't take the insult and change his mind, it makes for a perfect relationship. How much better would our relationships be if we did this? If both of us strove to do that. Okay? And I know there might be some strained relationships in here. Okay? Maybe your other half isn't here or whatever, and you're going, I wish he or she were listening to this. Okay? We can still make it better by realizing that where the analogy isn't perfect, we can still make it better. Because when Christ doesn't absorb it and just goes, it's good. Now let me flip into marriage prep mode for the last verse. Okay? Because I'm going to hit this last verse here for a second. And when I say marriage prep mode, Lucy and I do marriage prep with kids who are getting married. We go through the testing and do all this kind of stuff. So we're in that mode. And even before then, when we were first married, we went to marriage conferences and learned all that kind of stuff. We wanted to have a good relationship, so we did that kind of stuff. And I'll start by saying by mentioning something that Father John Ricardo says, and then I'll lead into this. Father John Ricardo says, and this is one of Lucy's favorite lines. Father John says that men and women are as different as they can possibly be and still be the same species. It's one more step, and they'd have to classify us differently. We are really different. And one of the ways that comes into manifest itself is in the way we speak. The speech habits. There's a course that we took one time, the Love and Respect Conference. And some of you probably have heard of it. And it teaches that men and women speak different languages. Men speak with the language of respect, and women speak in the language of love. It's just the way our brains work. It's just the way it works. So the problem is, guys, we speak, and we speak with this respect language. But our wives need love language to hear it. Women, you speak in love language, but our egos need to hear respect. And when one or the other, both of us, because of our fallen human nature, don't get what we need, we sometimes shrivel up. So it's difficult. I remember when I first heard about this course, we had a book, and I opened it up and I said, see if I wanted to do it. And in the first couple of pages, it was talking about this difference and how specifically that men need to hear that respect language. And I hadn't been able to put it into words, but I felt that was lacking. Now, I want to make perfectly clear, Lucy does not disrespect me. Okay, she doesn't. She's unbelievably loving. But she speaks in love language. And there was something in me, in my fallen human nature, that needed to hear some respect. And I was feeling a bit empty there. So, Paul is saying beautifully here that Love and Respect Conference comes from this last line here. In any case, each one of you, the husbands, love his wife as himself, and the wife should respect her husband. Love and Respect Conference. Saying, men, we know how to speak respect language, but we need to learn how to speak love to our wives. We're really good at speaking respect language. We can talk business contracts all day long. Boom, 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 boom. Right? But she needs love. We need to learn that language. Ladies, you can speak love all day long. I never doubt that Lucy loves me. But I need some of that respect language. It's just the way it works. So each one of us can help the other by learning a little bit of that other language to try and help, okay? To fill up that love bank in the other person, to do that. And Paul knows that I can't internalize that word properly unless I study it. So he says, each one of you, he doesn't say each one of you should love his wife, period. He says each one of you should love his wife as himself. He's been saying it over and over and over in the previous slides, right? Guys, this is the way you love. She's not cute, she's not a friend, she's not erotic plaything. Love as himself, willing the good of the other. That's the way you're supposed to love. And then he also, not in this sentence, but earlier, he also gives a little guidance to the wife, right? The very first time says, be subordinate to the husband as you would to the Lord. Giving you a little bit of an analogy. This is the way you entrust yourself. The same way you entrust yourself to Christ. Look for ways to be able to do that for your husband. And watch him grow and watch him be able to pour out love. Guys, stop thinking this is a marriage contract and pour out love and you will get respect in return. It's just the way it works. So, it's an amazing insight that Paul has here. There's a lot of good things that we learned about that course, from that course, including the power of 2 words. And I'm going to end with this. I was going to do some bonus stuff from marriage prep, but we don't have time, so I'm going to skip that. Maybe someday we'll do a marriage prep course here, or a marriage conference. Anyway, there were a lot of things that we learned from the course, including 2 words that were very powerful, very simple, but very powerful. Assume goodwill. Assume goodwill. If you've made the decision to marry someone, then part of your due diligence should be that you know that they were on your side. Otherwise, you shouldn't have made that decision, okay? And if you know that they're on your side for the long haul, and then they say something that sort of irks you, because you think that they're opposite you, sometimes it pays, even in the heat of the moment, to step back, recalibrate, and remember that they're on my side. Let's think about what they just said as someone who's on my side. Assume goodwill. And sometimes, just by doing that, you hear what they just said in a completely different way. So assume goodwill is a big one. You can also use that with other people, not just husbands and wives. Sometimes, somebody grates you the wrong way, but assume goodwill. Until they prove to you otherwise, assume goodwill. Try and frame it in that context. You live your life nicer. It's happier. It's one of those best ways to live. If we've done the due diligence and we know that that person is on our side, we should be so confident in the love of the other that we're willing to entrust our lives to the other. If we live that way, it's a beautiful life, okay? And we can always step it up a little bit. Even if it's only one side stepping it up, it tends to bring the other side up. So, subordinate yourselves to one another because your life is safe in their hands. That's the end of what Paul has to say in Ephesians 5. He continues in Ephesians 6 with the household code, and we'll go into that, and then he gets into the armor of God, where he takes everything he said in Ephesians and funnels it into this beautiful analogy that is more powerful than you can possibly imagine. 2,000 years later, we're still talking about it, and we just know it. It's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. So, just remember, husband and wife, both with free will, with an attitude of love, striving for each other's benefit. That's what Paul's talking about. I hope that this expanded your view of what Paul was talking about in Ephesians 5. And that's the end of Ephesians.